The Nutcracker Suite consists of 8 short movements taken from the music of a full-length ballet, The Nutcracker, by Piotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, composed for the St. Petersburg Opera House, where it was first performed in December 1892. Fantasia uses only the last 6 movements of the suite, uniting them in a nature ballet danced by flowers and plants, fairies and marine creatures through the changing seasons, from high summer through fall, and finally to winter. The suite begins early in the morning with Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, performed by Dewdrop fairies who flit over flowers, touching them with their wands and spangling them with dew. Chinese dance comes to life with Hop Low and the mushroom dancers. They shake themselves vigorously, throwing off the dew, then go into their dance. The mushrooms resemble Chinese men with long robes, coolie hats, and pigtails. The smallest mushroom, Hop Low, has difficulty keeping up with the routines and finally loses his place in the dance, but hops back in time to take a bow. In Dance of the Reed Flutes, blossoms drift down upon the surface of a stream. As they touch the water, their petals spread out, then slowly curve upward. With inverted petals, they resemble dancers in long swirling skirts. Arab dance takes us underwater, where an undulating forest of water plants becomes a harem and goldfish resemble languid odalisks. Russian dance is smartly executed by thistles who look like booted Cossacks with tall hats and fierce mustaches, and orchids who look like slim-waisted peasant girls in quaint headdresses and full skirts. Waltz of the Flowers, the final movement, is divided into 4 dances which illustrate the change of the season. In the first, the leaves change color when autumn fairies touch them. In the second, when the autumn fairies touch milkweed pods, out float silky milkweed seeds resembling classical ballerinas in white bouffant skirts, their black hair smooth and sleek. The third dance features the frost fairies, whose touch decorates nature with minute needles of blue-white ice. As they skate across the pond, its surface freezes, and they leave patterns on the glittering ice. Then snowflake fairies dance down, skirts whirling to the finale of the waltz. The principal object of any of the fine arts is to arouse a purely emotional reaction in the beholder, said Walt Disney when he introduced the story of the animated drawing on his Disneyland television show for November 30th, 1955. The example here is the Nutcracker Suite from Fantasia. This type of cartoon did not rely upon telling a story, but rather it attempted to create an emotional response in the audience by using form and color in motion to interpret fine music. That was Walt speaking in his Tom Sawyer mode. The Huck Finn in him said the same thing in conversation this way: "If I can't feel a theme, I can't make a film that anyone else will feel. I can't laugh at intellectual humor. I'm just corny enough to like to have a story hit me over the heart." The story of how mushrooms got into the Chinese dance in the Nutcracker Suite is a fine example of Walt Disney's taste in entertainment. The laughter and applause of audiences suggests that it is the most successful of all the moments in Fantasia at evoking the most frequent reaction to the film, the emotion of delight. Yet the story conference notes show that if Walt hadn't paid his characteristic attention to detail, the mushroom dance might well have lost out to some Chinese lizards.
Say what?
At the beginning of the concert feature story exploration under Dick Humor in the old apartment house at Hyperion, a story man named Jerry Brewer was assigned to continuity development of the Nutcracker Suite with an extensive crew. As overall story director, Humor would visit the crew every day to see what they'd done. If it seemed to be working, if it was ready to show to Walt. Humor remembered this part as particular fun because 3 imaginative women were making sketches for the storyboard: Sylvia Moberly Holland, Bianca Marjoley, and Ethel Kulser. They would pick weeds in vacant lots near the studio and bring them in and draw them up as dancers in the Nutcracker Suite ballet of nature. A mass of common thistles, for example, suggested an energetic band of Cossacks, complete with belted blouses, tall hats, and boots. From there it was a short step to seeing clusters of orchids as lovely peasant girls in quaint headdresses and full skirts. And there you had the cast for the Russian dance. At this time, the Disney studio had a camera club whose monthly shows were given critiques by celebrated local photographers. Hidden away in a studio news release on the club is the information that one of the Disney Camera Club members had a private sideline of photographing flowers and mushrooms, prints of which he kept mounted in a book at the studio. During early research on the Nutcracker Suite, the sequence director saw this book, recognized that many mushrooms had an oriental look. The sequence director of the Nutcracker Suite was Sam Armstrong, the background artist on Snow White, who painted the memorable watercolors of the 7 Dwarfs' cottage as the princess first sees it. Armstrong apparently asked a character designer named John Walbridge to make some drawings of mushrooms that looked like Chinese, and Walbridge used the radical structure of the plant to suggest coolie hats and eyes with apicanthic folds. Brewer assigned these characters a minor role in the Chinese dance as lamplighters lighting up dewdrops, and Walbridge did another model sheet full of mushroom drawings. Confusing his fungi, he called them Chinese toadstool dancers. Oh no! In these drawings, he made their stocky bodies suggest people in tight robes that reached down to the ground and permitted locomotion only through small steps. Nevertheless, Jerry Brewer made no mention of mushrooms when he wrote his brief synopsis of the visual accompaniment planned for the Nutcracker Suite on November 1st, 1938. "This is to be a typical Oriental dance," wrote Brewer of the Chinese dance. "Chinese, Japanese, Javanese, or Siamese, in which one male dancer with high decorative headdress, short, tight skirt, and curled-toe shoes executes an authentic dance before a background of swaying Oriental girls. The entire dance is staged for a frog mandarin." 3 weeks later, Brewer spread out the rough continuity sketches and explained what he envisioned to Disney. For more than a year, Walt had been following the gradual development of the sequence, which now had Oriental lizards dancing for a frog mandarin, and he was not satisfied. "I don't know, Jerry," said Walt. "Here's what I see. There's something very valuable in these little mushrooms that look like Chinese characters. That in itself is valuable, and you want to have a chance to see them and see what they do." Toward the end of the meeting, after several other sections of the Nutcracker had been discussed, Walt went back to the character model drawings of the Chinese mushrooms that were dated November 4th, 1938. "I like these models," said Walt. "I don't think we can improve much on them. They're the result of a hell of a lot of work. Johnny worked on them a year or so ago, then came back with these new ones that I think are very good. The poppies are ideal for the Chinese things, and the mushrooms look swell for the little coolies." At the end of the meeting, Disney cautioned Brewer against much elaboration on the lizard frog mandarin approach to the Chinese dance. "Jerry," he said, "I think you could work on this from the angle that you don't go into such elaborate sketches until we arrive at what we're going to do. I think we'll get farther with it now. We've got a certain line on it. Just work on it and keep it simple, and we can get together on it in about a week." Reading between the lines of the story conference notes, one conceived that the models of the mushrooms as Chinese coolies had hit Walt over the heart. The Chinese dance was performed, according to the program, by Hoplo and the Mushroom Dancers. This brief sequence is one of the highest points that the animated film has yet reached. Hoplo, the littlest mushroom, projects his personality as vividly as any character in the Disney galaxy, yet he has no dialogue, makes no sound, and doesn't even have a face or hands to gesture with. He is the best example of the Disney Studios' genius for compression, its ability to spring an entire character from a simple design in motion. Indeed, the only three artists that Walt Disney credited the Nutcracker Suite character designs are John Walbridge, Elmer Plummer, who drew the mushrooms in color, and Ethel Kulser, who designed the Russian thistles. Normally, the sequence director would take over from the story department when the story was finished. In this case, Sam Armstrong took over from Jerry Brewer while the story was still being developed. He and Walt threw out the idea of using the mushrooms as lamplighters, lighting the dewdrops, and made them the only performers of the Chinese dance. After that, the idea of contrasting a little mushroom with big mushrooms grew out of the music, and Walbridge's November 4 model sheet, which showed a big mushroom juggling 3 little mushrooms. In the Chinese dance, said a storyman identified in the notes only as R, you have an antithesis, a contrast between the brilliant piccolos and the pizzicato strings. That should be brought out more on the screen, so the same design doesn't go through these two. If you have the same decoration on the screen with the two contrasting parts of the music, it doesn't go together, it seems to me. The criticism bore fruit. An artist identified in the notes as P suggested that it might be small mushrooms and large mushrooms. Yes, that would be it exactly, said R, and when the small mushrooms were simplified to be one small mushroom, Hoplo was born. Considering how little the animator had to work with, it was likely that the Chinese dance would have been animated without the little fellow emerging as a personality on the screen. If you want to see how likely, watch the broom come to life and go through his paces in The Sorcerer's Apprentice without developing a memorable personality. The animator who put the spark of personality into Hoplo was Arthur Babbitt. When Art Babbitt was asked what he thought made the dancing mushrooms work so well, he answered, "An element of warmth was injected, a little story was told. It was the story of one character who was constantly out of step with all the others, and he never did quite get into the crowd, except there was on one occasion, I think it was the scene, where he marches towards the camera and then on back as if he were reviewing his troops, which gives you an indication of the little guy's cocky character. In spite of the fact that almost everything he does is wrong, it's full of mistakes. He does have his one moment of glory when he does it just right. He is not aware, or he refuses to accept, that he is at fault, that there is something wrong with him." Now, how did he develop and dance his way out of the chorus? Babbitt was asked. He developed in many ways, said Babbitt. For instance, the anticipation for his steps at the beginning of the dance is almost a direct swipe, although you may never have recognized it, from these three zanies who keep slapping each other all around, the Three Stooges. One of the Three Stooges always did a funny little action where the knees overlap. When he would get angry, he would do this little furious step with his knees crossing, one over the other. And instead of just an ordinary anticipation, I used this because the music called for a trill. So doing that trill, he did this little anticipatory act. Also, the music dictated certain things. I don't know a hell of a lot about music, but there is a phrase that is stated once. There's a statement. Then I think it's repeated, the same phrase. Then there's an answer. I don't remember if it's repeated once or twice. And then they came back to the original line of music, so they gave me the architecture. Babbitt remembered the color models of the mushrooms drawn by Elmer Plummer. Mushrooms as the personifications of a small group of Chinese, dressed in long robes and wearing coolie hats with just a suggestion of pigtail underneath. Plummer's drawings were very nice, he said, but as you work with them and endow them with life, as they start to animate, certain changes take place. So the animation changed the design slightly from Plummer's drawings. And then there were other changes that took place when Bill Hertz, Babbitt's assistant, cleaned up my drawings. And then there were enhancing things that were added by the effects department. The sequence begins with mushrooms vigorously throwing off the morning dew, and Babbitt praised the effects artists who created the little drops of dew glistening. To work out the choreography, Babbitt drew with the music score pinned to his desk, so that he could relate the action not only to the melodic line, but also to the counterpoint, quote-unquote, those nasty little notes underneath. For instance, in the Chinese dance, Babbitt explains, there's a bass underneath, so something has to be related to that too. So I played the music over and over again and studied the sheet. I began to see what is happening. I can actually see it. When you have the bub 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 bub, that's the little guy coming forward, and then it repeats, and then he goes backwards. Al Zinin, the layout man, planned the overall ideal composition, said Babbitt, but you can't stick with that, because your characters are moving around constantly, and what might be a composition for one bit of action doesn't necessarily fit a succeeding bit of action. And your camera is not nailed down. In effect, you are the camera. The only choreographic suggestion I ever got came from Walt Disney himself. I had animated the little mushroom taking his bow on the last note of music. Walt suggested he take the bow after. Both ways would have worked, depending on one's translation of the little guy's character. Art Babbitt is a camera with brains and a pulse. In the Chinese dance, through a combination of perfect timing, a masterful use of space, and the ability to emphasize with the little mushroom, he achieved more with less than any other animator in history. But without Disney's timely intervention, it might have been the dance of the Chinese lizards. The Nutcracker Suite was the natural culmination of a decade of efforts by the Disney studio to use the rhythm of nature as the subject of animated films. These efforts began in 1929 and 1930 with a cycle of silly symphonies on the theme of the seasons, springtime in 1929 and summer, autumn, and winter in 1930. In these cartoons, the Disney studio gave a visual interpretation of the spirit of nature through patterns of action, carefully related to snatches of such popular classics as Dance of the Hours, which also appears on the Fantasia program. In the earlier visualization of Dance of the Hours, frogs eat insects, birds eat frogs, in what Don Graham, head of the Disney Studio Art School, called an unwinding sequence of lively actions, always ending in extermination. Action and music combined to create a specific atmosphere, the essence of spring and youth, with the inevitable reminder of death. In such cartoons as The Grasshopper and the Ants, when the winter wind blows fall colors to icy hues, Disney added change of color to movement as an expression of the rhythm of the seasons. But in all these cartoons, birds, animals, and insects did most of the dancing. As early as May 1935, however, Disney story people began working on a much more imaginative fantasy idea in which the inanimate world of plants and flowers would join in the dance. When they first began kicking the idea around, it was intended for a silly symphony to be called Ballet des Fleurs. By the time it went into production, it had become part of the concert feature and would embrace most of Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite. Samuel Armstrong was one of the 10 directors whom Disney assigned to oversee Fantasia's 8 sequences from the time they left the story rooms until they reached the screen. Armstrong directed Toccata and Fugue and the Nutcracker Suite. James Elgar directed The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Bill Roberts and Paul Satterfield co-directed The Rite of Spring, with Roberts handling the sequences with dinosaurs. Hamilton Luske, Jim Handley, and Ford Beebe co-directed The Pastoral Symphony. Teehee and Norman Ferguson co-directed The Dance of the Hours. And Wilfred Jackson directed both Night on Bald Mountain and Ave Maria. Some of the units that worked under a Fantasia director were very large. Armstrong's unit had no fewer than 53 artists. When Walt Disney made Fantasia, the Nutcracker was no longer in the repertoire of any ballet company, and, as George Balanchine lamented, people think of the Nutcracker as a suite rather than a ballet. First, it was a ballet. In 1954, Balanchine revived the full-length Nutcracker with the New York City Ballet, and it has been a Christmas sellout ever since. The search for ideas was wide and varied, reported the Fantasia edition of the Disney Studio Horse Organ. No doubt remembering that the models for the Russian Cossack thistles were discovered in a vacant lot near the studio, Disney sent Sylvia Holland, of story development, Ethel Kulser, of background paintings, Kurt Perkins, and Herman Schultes to Idlewild, a real nature preserve, in search of similar inspiration. When they came back to the studio, they photographed the drawings they had made on what the Disney studio called a leica reel. It was a device for projecting the drawings a frame at a time in synchronization with the appropriate musical passage, so that Walt could see, for example, what music fit best with orange leaves, what with red, what with clematis seeds, what with milkweed pods. It was a way to determine if the staging of a scene felt right with the music before spending the time and money necessary to animate the scenes. When the music reached the point where the frost fairies are to arrive, for example, the leica reel's electric eye would simply trigger the projection of a story sketch of frost fairies. The image either worked with the musical passage or didn't. Throughout the Nutcracker Suite, we see the conference method operating at its best, with ideas being tossed around until they suggested drawings, with the drawings in the leica reel changing and evolving until they clicked. One day, when Walt was attending a meeting, he suddenly said to Ed Plum, the music director, "We want to cut the overture." "We talked of that too," said Plum. "You mean it's okay?" said Walt. "I expected a battle." Although Disney had final authority, he did allow himself to be talked out of ideas, as when in Bambi, he wanted to show the charred bodies of the hunters burned to death by the forest fire they had carelessly started. "How do you want the bodies drawn, Walt?" asked one of his artists. "Medium rare or well done?" Walt dropped the idea. "Now here's what I like to see after the march, which we'll use as the overture," said Walt. "We'll go into the Sugar Plum Fairy. The march ends with a boom, and we fade out and fade in on one of the Dewdrop fairies. Then we end that, then go out, and the lamplighters come in, and the place is full of dewdrops. Carry the dewdrops into the Chinese dance, with the lamplighters, and at the end of the lamplighting sequence, we find the mandarin there, And then the poppies blow off and come down and form those little Chinese figures that do the dance. The dance of the reed flutes around the mandarin, and he can join in with these little figures and go back to sit on his throne. Then we can figure out an ending to that would lead us underwater for the Arab dance with the goldfish. In the end, the first two movements were omitted, and the mushrooms became the only figures in the Chinese dance. Also, the original order of the movements had been somewhat altered, wrote Deems Taylor, on the theory that since the work is a suite and not a symphony, there is no vital connection among the movements, and that the order in which they are heard, provided to be musically effective, is immaterial. In devising the animated screen pictures that go with the music, Walt Disney was confronted with the fact that if he presented the suite simply as a series of dances with no central theme, the result would be merely a group of unrelated short subjects. Disney's solution was to envision the suite as a whole, as a ballet of nature, danced by plants, flowers, fairies, and marine creatures. Sugar Plum Fairies did not fit in with Disney's nature ballet theme, so they were transformed into Dewdrop Fairies, sprites who decorate dandelions and spiderwebs with dewdrops so that they sparkle in the sunshine. A special transparent paint was developed for this dance, adding greatly to its beauty. Director Sam Armstrong had suggested to Walt that the fairies can dart around like a hummingbird, then stay poised, still in the air with their wings humming, then dart again. Les Clark animated the scene in which the fairy hovers around the honeysuckle, decorating it with dewdrops, and the fairy's dart and hover movements did indeed result from Clark's study of rapidly fluttering hummingbirds. In the Disney version of Dance of the Reed Flutes, inverted blossoms wafted by a breeze suggest ballerinas with gauzy bell-shaped skirts. That was the way Walt saw them when he looked at some flower sketches. "Those little flowers," he said, "I see no reason why they can't dance right on the water. If you throw a flower blossom on the water, it floats. They could skim right on the water. It would make a beautiful setup. When those little blossoms land on the water, it's almost like the wind is blowing them around, just like the little things are dancing. But really the wind is blowing them. Then in the end, that boom, they all go over something and disappear." As it reached the screen, a white flower landed on the stream in a pattern of swirling movement that is one of the loveliest in Fantasia. It is carried ahead of the multicolored flowers like a solo dancer accompanied by a colorful chorus. Cy Young, an effects animator with a feeling for the abstract, did this scene, and he also whirled the blossoms toward the camera and boom over a waterfall, which turned out to be the something they all go over and disappear. Considerable live-action film was shot for this dance, performed by two professional dancers, Joyce Coles and Marjorie Belcher. Miss Belcher had already modeled for Snow White and for the Blue Fairy in Pinocchio. For this dance, she and Miss Coles were costumed in long tulle ballet skirts that resembled the shape of the blossoms that were to skim across the water. The difference between that live action and the animation that resulted is the difference between dancing on a stage and dancing on water. Arab dance is an underwater ballet performed by goldfish. Walt knew exactly what he wanted here. There should be a regular festival, a ballet of fish, all to that slow Arabian music. All the undergrowth has a slow, wavy rhythm to the slow beats. You've seen travelogues where they take you into a harem. As you go through the courtyard, veiled ladies peek through the windows and duck back. If the cameraman wants to get a picture, they run away. Two girls peek out and see a stranger and giggle and get back to cover. Disney's story sketch artist gave him exactly what he wanted. Goldfish peeking through undersea coral formations that suggests the latticework of the harem behind which Arab women were concealed. Walt studied the sketches and spurred his artists on. These fish are beautiful, lazy things, very feminine and sexy, even going further than the sketches. There is a natural hoochie-coochie motion to a goldfish that could be made use of here. To study that natural hoochie-coochie motion in humans so that it would be available for reference by the animators, director Armstrong and storyman Norman Wright arranged to shoot live action of an Arab dancer. One day, Sam Armstrong was informed by casting that Princess Omar would see him at 3 o'clock. At 5 minutes to 3, Armstrong and Wright found awaiting them a swarthy-skinned Arab interpreter, a brown-eyed comely maid, and her mother. The interpreter explained the phenomenal experience of the princess, who had danced before crowned heads. The princess then retired to her dressing room. When she reappeared, clad mostly in her reputation, she performed something vaguely appropriate for a harem to a phonograph record. The interpreter explained that she normally carried her own Arab orchestra, but had been uncertain of Disney requirements. He asked Armstrong for his reactions. Armstrong explained that what he wanted was this, and this, and this. The interpreter turned to the princess and, speaking in Arabic, gave quite a lot of time to explain the Disney requirements. The princess listened carefully, then turned to Sam Armstrong.
"Sure,"
she said.
"It's a cinch."
Think of her when you see the silky, sinuous movements of the fish in Arab dance. Walt Disney had over 1,000 employees at the time he was making Fantasia. Of the 53 who worked on the Nutcracker Suite, only 22 received credit in the program. There were no credits on the screen at the time. Some studied belly dancers and drew goldfish. Others studied ballerinas and drew blossoms. One drew a little mushroom and thought of the Three Stooges. Otis Ferguson of the New Republic was right on the mark when he said of Disney at this period. He apparently has known how to pick his men, train them, and give them free rein to contribute their individual best. A film is a collective enterprise anyway, and should be made that way. But in general, there are too few men of talent at the top who have the leadership and patience, the exaltation of job over ego to do it. Walt Disney is a pioneer in more things than his conception of and tireless experiment with the animated cartoon as a reflection of life. For example, it was the function of a Disney director to explain to the layout artists and animators in his unit exactly what Walt wanted. As an audio-visual guide, the animator would get a phonograph record, nowadays it is a CD, of the sound for his scenes, a photostat of the storyboard worked out by Walt and his story department, and an exposure sheet made out by the director. As explained in the first chapter, an exposure sheet is the guide to the timing of the scene. But in a sequence as subtle as the Arab dance, a good animator would rely on his own sense of timing. Animators Don Lusk and Sandy Struthers had to suggest both goldfish and belly dancers at the same time. In one scene, for instance, the fish even suggests a woman wearing sheer harem pants by the quickly changing positions of its undulating fins. Artists who would later rise to the top of their professions contributed to the Nutcracker Suite. John Hench, Senior Vice President and Prime Visualizer at WED, the Glendale, California dream tank that Walt founded to design his amusement parks, began by painting backgrounds for the Nutcracker Suite and later emerged as one of the studio's top colorists on such features as Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, and Peter Pan. Jules Engel, now head of the animation graphics department of the California Institute of the Arts, contributed a number of pastel drawings of thistles and orchids on black paper that he says inspired Sam Armstrong to stage the Chinese and Russian dances against black rather than against the naturalistic backgrounds that are the style of the rest of the Nutcracker Suite. Waltz of the Flowers took its inspiration from a comment that Walt made at a story conference when he said, "I'm just wondering, we've devoted a lot of our picture to flowers as they are in the summer with their full color, and I'm just wondering if there isn't enough beauty in autumn itself. Then I think your opening would be changing from summer colors into the colors of autumn. The leaves, everything that would show a change. That harp music is swell for the color change." In the finished film, the heart glissandos accompany the change of the leaves from pale green to yellow to orange as the autumn fairies move around them, touching them, turning them into the colors of autumn. When the frost fairies touch the leaves encrust with frost into a virtuoso display of effects animation. The frost fairies freeze the water with a skating action animated by Robert Stokes, which includes a marvelous recreation of the 1-2-3 step glide of human skaters as it might be executed by fairy sprites. Of all things of beauty in Fantasia, the Milkweed Ballet is the most poignantly lovely. Autumn fairies touch milkweed pods, and milkweed ballerinas emerge and are airborne. It is late in the season, and their dance is brief. "If you have a pod and the fairies touch it," Walt told the story meeting, "all the seeds fly out almost as if they're alive. Actually, the wind does it, but you get the illusion they're alive. I think there's something beautiful in those seeds balleting through the air. I like to use them because we can get off the ground and have our ballet in the air." These abstractions of dancers, whose milky-colored puffs resemble white tulle skirts, whose dark seeds gleam like the slick black hair of Ludmila Cherina, dancing Les Sylphides in the red shoes, float to the earth like parachutes against a deep blue background, while autumn leaves whirl through their scenes on gusts of wind. The composition of these scenes, Bruce Bushman and Robert Cormack did the layouts, Brad Case and George Rowley the animation, is very fine. The eye can follow the movements of a large number of milkweed ballerinas because they form a harmonious pattern within the central field of vision. At the climax, snow begins to fall. Small snowflake fairies come from a distance toward the camera, filling the air with eddying, sparkling crystals, beautifully timed in their movement by George Rowley. At the end, snow covers the landscape. Those skirts of snowflake crystals whirling down from the heavens made a moving image that Walt was determined to put on the screen. He had tried to get it into The Coming of Winter in Bambi, but it was too fanciful. He saw it again while listening to Rachmaninoff's Troika, then rejected Troika for Fantasia. Now, finally, when the Waltz of the Flowers was changed to portray autumn and the coming of winter, the trait he called his stick-it-to-itivity found a place for them. One of the most arduous tasks in developing an overall style for the Nutcracker, said the Disney Studio house organ, was getting away from the 10-acre lot type of staging and finally achieving a tiny and intimate world as a stage. In this gnat's eye view of things was fantasy finally found. It was found, in fact, in the quality that gives Walt Disney's imagination its enduring charm. "It is the charm," wrote Otis Ferguson in 1934, "of an imagination that can perceive all sorts of fantastic attitudes and action in things so common, so near to anyone's hand, that the sudden contrast of what they might be with what they certainly are not is universally droll, and not to be resisted. And so mushrooms are contrasted with Chinese dancers, thistles with Russian dancers, and goldfish with Arab dancers. A white blossom is imagined to be a prima ballerina, and a breeze becomes her music." Dance critic Walter Terry wrote, "Dance lovers will find much of Fantasia rewarding in its choreographic scope, stimulating in its brilliant use of a great art, bringing great dance and simple dance to everyone. This is nowhere truer than in the Nutcracker Suite, where animated fantasy finds a corps de ballet in a milkweed pod.